The Huawei story seems to underscore your point, which is that the trade tensions, and particularly the actions around Huawei from the US, will only accelerate domestic build-out of some of these core technologies.
Right. I mean, in the short term, I think Huawei are going to face a lot of pain. CTE saw that last year. But in the long term, I think this will accelerate local development. I think much maligned has been the Chinese chip industry, their ability to develop operating systems. There's nothing like the motivation of long-term sustainability, threats to their businesses, threats to their core competencies that would motivate both the companies as well as government and the private sector to deputize themselves to build out self-sufficiency.
I mean, the problem is, and you touched on the skepticism around their ability to build out some of these complex chips. This has been a priority for the government well before these trade tensions really kicked off. And companies like Huawei have been investing 10% of their revenues every year in R&D, and they still don't have the ability to build chips for things like the core network and the antennas. So there would be many out there who say, look, this is years away still, and they remain almost entirely dependent on the US and others for some of these core chips.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's a common refrain. I think that in the short term, there will be pain, but there's nothing like a situation like this to motivate people. 10 years ago, they didn't have this kind of pressure. When in 1957 the Americans saw Sputnik go across the sky, that motivated them to start DARPA, NASA, a Defense Education Act that enabled students to get cheap loans for going to study the STEM disciplines. And so I expect similar actions locally to deputize and invigorate the local industry.
And Ben, I'm just wondering, Apple CEO Tim Cook, he spoke to CBS a couple of days ago, and he says so far they're not being targeted by China, but there's this growing speculation out there that what the U.S. did to Huawei, Beijing could do to a company like Apple as well. If that is the case, if Beijing urges local companies not to supply to Apple, what options do they really have?
It's going to be a scary world. I mean, this concept of decoupling that applies not only to supply chains, but to the capital markets, to students. I think Apple and a lot of American companies who are wholly dependent on Chinese inputs that might be ultimately are assembled in the United States, though, are in big trouble. And I think we've only kind of just scratched the surface of what retaliatory measures could be taken by the Chinese side across all of those different verticals if there's not a reconciliation on Huawei in the very short term.
And where do you think we go? What's next, Ben? Just give us a guess. How far can this go, or how far can the Chinese go, let's put it that way, without actually shooting themselves in the foot?
That's a tough question. I mean, you saw yesterday or the day before them trying to dissuade tourists and students from going to the United States. So it's early days in terms of what can be done here. I think that the Chinese generally have showed a fair degree of restraint here. They understand the damage this goes into both markets, and so they've held back largely. But our fear is that even if a trade deal does get struck, that trust, that certainty now is broken, and so in the long term, even a superficial kind of transaction struck between Xi and President Trump, say at the G20, won't reconcile that mistrust, and so it could go on for quite a ways from here.